Africa program. Our webinar today is about tensions in the Middle East, implications of African security, and digital infrastructure. So this webinar is going to illustrate the economic, security, and political implications of the evolving Middle East crisis and how African governments and institutions can prepare for and respond to these emerging challenges. So my name is Rosalind Kwaramba. I'm a research associate at RLRI Research Institute. I'll be your co-moderator. Joining me, the main moderator, is Ima Makong. She is a peace builder and a communication specialist with expertise in external relations and communication of stakeholder engagement. With this, she has served as a programs associate at Africa Office of UN University for Peace, as well as UN Stabilization Mission in Democratic Republic of Congo as an associate political affairs officer. In these roles, she has contributed towards conflict analysis, mediation, and peace building processes. So please do help me in welcoming Immaculate Macomb.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roslyn, and good afternoon, everyone. I think it's a great delight that I am co-moderating this session with you, Roslyn, and I've also had time to go through the profiles of the different speakers that we have this afternoon. I don't know what time you have. I am moderating this session from Cameroon in West Africa, and we have 2 p.m. That's why I'm saying this afternoon. So it's a pleasure for me. I'm looking forward to learning more of learning because I find the topic very timely and very relevant. And when I was reached out to moderate this session, I was excited about it because I want to believe that there's much that I'll be taking home. But again, it's going to be an exchange, like Roslyn has said, and I think we are all in the know about how Africa most often is impacted by global crisis. I want to qualify it as a global crisis, what is going on in the Middle East, because we know that the US has a strong military presence in Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa. And we are looking at a country like Djibouti in particular with over 4,000 members of the US Army. And then we are looking at tensions in countries like Somalia, and also the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And we cannot begin to, overemphasize the implications that this may have for the African continent, particularly East Africa and the Horn of Africa. So I'm really looking forward to us discussing, because I understand that this afternoon we are engaging with researchers, but also with policymakers who are going to drive this conversation forward, and the outcome of this discussion is going to go a long way to help our governments. I'm talking about African governments know how to respond to the current conflict in the Middle East. So, Roslyn, I'm not sure if we have questions for the audience. I'm going to have to let you confirm or do that. If not, then I would want to go straight away to introducing our speaker, because I understand we have just 1 hour in our hands.
Okay, so for the participants, we only have housekeeping notes. To share your questions and contributions, you'll be using the chat box. If you want to speak during the Q&A session, please do raise your hand and unmute your mic so you make your contribution. And please do note that this session will be recorded. So the Q&A will be done soon after the panelists
Mm.
have made their presentations.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm moving straight away to introduce to you all our first speaker. And here I'm talking about Alvin. Please forgive me if I mispronounce the name. I should have reached out to you before now to get the right pronunciation. Alvin Hockey, is that correct? Okay,
That's
thank you.
100%
So
correct, yeah.
okay, thank you. He is the founder of NXCom Global, and it is specialized in telecom and digital infrastructure strategy. And he has nearly 30 years of global experience and former C-level roles across leading operators. And he now advises operators and governments, as well as investors, on digital transformation and connectivity. He is doing a presentation to us today, or he will be speaking to us today on the Middle East conflicts, like we have said, but particularly on Africa's digital future and why this is a turning point for telecoms in sub-Saharan Africa. So please, it is my pleasure to welcome you, Alvin.
Thank you so much, and thank you to your audience as well for having me. Okay, so shall we start?
So Alvin, yeah, I think everything is okay. Alvin has 15, in the next 15 minutes, Alvin will be speaking to us on why the crisis in the Middle East is actually a turning point for Africa's telecoms and digital future. Alvin, if you're ready, I see your slides are already on.
Thank you so much. And thank you to your audience. So good morning, good afternoon, depending really on where you're joining from. Welcome. This isn't just a geopolitical story. It's a telecom story, and more importantly, a digital infrastructure story. What's happening in the Middle East right now is not isolated. It's beginning to impact how data moves globally, and that includes Africa. What I'd like to do today is unpack what's happening beneath the surface, why Africa is more exposed than we think, and what this means going forwards. Next slide, please. Let me start with a simple observation. Having worked across multiple operators in Africa over the years, one thing becomes very clear. Our digital ecosystem is deeply dependent on infrastructure we don't control. If you look at most operator strategies over the past decade, we focused heavily on access networks, spectrum, and customer growth. Very little attention has been gone into where our international dependencies actually sits, largely because the system has been stable. We haven't had to think about it until now. For a long time, that wasn't the problem. Capacity was growing, costs were coming down, and the system was working. What we are seeing now is different, very different. This goes beyond normal disruption. It is effectively a stress test on the system itself, and it is exposing both risk and opportunity. Next slide, please. The problem. To understand the impact, we need to look at how the system is structured. A large portion of Africa's international connectivity flows through a small number of global choke points. These include the Red Sea, the Suez Corridor, and the broader Middle East. They are not just trade routes, they are digital lifelines. What makes these routes critical is not just geography, but concentration. A relatively small number of cables running through a small number of corridors are carrying a disproportionate amount of international connectivity. That's where the risk sits. These are not high volume routes. They are high dependency routes. So when disruption occurs here, it doesn't stay local. It becomes a global issue. Next slide, please. It's important to add some nuance here. Africa is not a single uniform network. West Africa connects largely through the Atlantic into Europe, while East and Southern Africa are far more dependent on routes passing through the Middle East. So while the level of dependency varies, the exposure remains. Africa's connectivity may not be eventually disrupted, but its vulnerability is indeed. So next slide, please. This is not theatrical. We are already seeing early signals. We're seeing delays in subsea cable deployments, increasing infrastructure risk, rising logistics and equipment costs, and growing pressure on operator margins. We've also seen disruptions in key corridors impact traffic across multiple markets. For example, subsea cable disruptions in the Red Sea over the past year have affected connectivity across parts of East and Southern Africa. In some cases, cables have been damaged due to anchor drags and instability in the region. Operators have had to reroute traffic, often very much longer distances. While the network continues to function, latency increases, congestion builds, and service quality starts to degrade. We're also seeing delays in new cable deployments, which means future capacity is not arriving as quickly as expected. At the same time, hyperscalers are increasing investment in local caching and data centers. While this improves performance, it is also a clear move to reduce reliance on international routes and improve resilience. So the system is already under pressure. And just to ground this point, while most traffic today is local, global connectivity still depends heavily on these international routes. Next slide, please. Bandwidth economics. This is where it becomes very real for the operators. For years, Africa's digital growth has been built on a simple assumption that bandwidth costs will continue to fall. That assumption has enabled data growth, streaming, cloud adoption, and the expansion of digital services. But that model depends on stable infrastructure and continuous capacity expansion, and both are under pressure. We've effectively optimized for cost efficiency rather than resilience. That worked in a stable environment, but it becomes a risk in a more volatile one. If bandwidth costs stabilize or begin to increase in certain corridors, it doesn't just affect operators. It affects pricing, affordability, and ultimately how quickly digital adoption can continue. This becomes a broader economic issue, not just a network issue. Next slide, please. We've seen disruption before. COVID affected supply chains and equipment shortages slowed deployments. What makes this different is that this is geopolitical in nature. Geopolitical risk introduces uncertainty, volatility, and structural instability. These are not risks operators can control or easily engineer around, and that makes long-term planning significantly more complex. Next slide, please. At the same time, operators are being squeezed from both sides. On the cost side, energy costs are rising. Many networks remain heavily diesel dependent, and infrastructure costs are increasing. On the demand side, consumers are becoming more price sensitive. Enterprises are delaying ICT investment, and device upgrade cycles are slowing. Costs are going up while demand is softening. That creates a very difficult operating environment. Next slide, please. The big shift. This is where the discussion becomes more interesting, because what we are seeing is not just disruption, but a broader structural shift. We are moving away from a globally optimized model towards one that places greater emphasis on regional resilience. Globally, we are seeing more investment in regional infrastructure, greater focus on sovereignty, and increased emphasis on control over critical systems. This translates into a shift towards local infrastructure, regional ecosystems, and built-in redundancy. Efficiency has been the dominant design principle for years, but resilience is now becoming as important. Next slide, please. Within this shift lies a real opportunity for Africa. This is the moment to rethink how infrastructure is built. There is a clear role for data centers in localizing traffic, for terrestrial fiber in strengthening continental connectivity, and for satellite as an additional layer of resilience. South Africa is also well positioned to play a stronger role as a regional gateway. But unlocking this opportunity is not just about building infrastructure. It's about how that infrastructure is structured, how that infrastructure is financed, and how different stakeholders align around it. This is not just about reducing risk, it's about creating control over Africa's digital future. Next slide, please. So what must be done? This is not a situation that can be approached passively. Operators need to rethink network design, build redundancy, diversify routing, and expand beyond connectivity. As for governments, they need to enable infrastructure investment and critically remove bottlenecks. As for investors, they need to recognize that digital infrastructure is becoming a strategic asset. Next slide, please. To close, the situation is highlighting something we've always known, but often overlooked. Africa's digital future remains externally dependent. The difference now is that this dependency is being tested. That creates a choice. Africa can continue to rely on external systems and absorb the impact, or it can invest, localize, and build more resilient infrastructure. This is not simply a risk to manage. It's a strategic reset. And those who recognize that early will define the next phase of Africa's digital growth. Thank you very much, everybody. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alvin. Oh, yeah, I can see the reactions, and I think that it has been very insightful. And thank you for also respecting the time frame. So I think the key takeaway is that what is happening in the Middle East is a test to Africa's digital future, and it highlights the fact that Africa is still very reliant on the Middle East for its digital growth. Like Alvin has said, this is an opportunity for Africa to rethink how its digital infrastructure is structured and probably how it is controlled. Thank you again, Alvin. Because we don't have much time, I want to introduce right away our next speaker. He is Solomon Kimaita, and he is an accomplished lecturer in international relations at diplomacy at Zetech University in Nairobi, Kenya, and he is specialized in peace and conflict studies. He holds a master's degree. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I was introducing Solomon, and I'm happy that Solomon can hear me now very well. And I was saying that he is an accomplished lecturer of international relations and diplomacy in Zetech University in Nairobi, that is in Kenya, specializing in peace and conflict studies. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the United States International University, Africa, and he also holds a bachelor's degree in social studies, government and public administration from the Moore University in Eldoret, Kenya. He is a certified professional mediator and has certifications in pedagogy and academic quality assurance. He has contributed to multiple academic conferences and published in peer-reviewed journals on emerging themes like AI in conflict prevention and youth participation in climate resilience and digital diplomacy. So this is the person, Solomon Kimaita, who will be talking to us today on the implications of the Middle East crisis on African security and politics, and he will be laying emphasis on foreign relations, which are increasing risk to violent extremism in Gulf states and investments in the region. It will also it is also affecting military bases in the Horn of Africa, like I had mentioned in the introduction. So we are going to be looking at the impacts on these areas as far as security is concerned. So please join me welcome our next speaker, Solomon Kimaite. Welcome, Solomon.
Thank you, Immaculate, for that good introduction, and greetings to our audience from Nairobi. So I will be tackling the implications of the Middle East instability on Africa security and politics. We can move to the next slide. So the first thing that we need to highlight is the growing and the deepening interdependence between the Middle East and Africa. And we can be able to see this from three perspectives. The first one is economic interdependence. We have a lot of investments from the Middle East, especially in the area of infrastructure, especially in the area of logistics as well as energy. And the main point of attraction for these investments is mineral resources in Africa. The next area of interdependence is security. And we notice that these two regions are linked by the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And that means that whatever conflicts happen in the Middle East, whether it is in Yemen, whether it is in Gaza, will be transmitted through maritime disruptions to Africa. And of course, this also prompts African countries to venture into military alignments. The other area of interdependence is politics and culture. We notice that the two regions have a lot in common in terms of religion. We have a lot in terms of migration, a lot of Africans working in the Middle East, a lot of investors from the Middle East into Africa, and so on and so forth. And of course, because of the economic and security imperatives, we have a lot of diplomatic interactions between Africa and the Middle East. So what this means is that whatever happens in the Middle East will definitely have repercussions in Africa. We can move to the next slide, please. So the first impact that we want to look at is foreign relations. And what comes to mind here is that we have a lot of rivalries among the Middle East countries. Unfortunately, those rivalries are now playing out in Africa. In short, you're saying that Africa has become a theater for these rivalries among the Middle East countries. And what African countries are facing is competing offers from the Middle East countries. If you need infrastructure investments, the Middle East countries are more than ready to offer that. If you need political support, the Middle East countries are more than ready to offer that. So that leads us to two implications. First is what I refer to as competitive alignment. And what is mostly happening in African countries is that they've learned the art of engaging multiple external actors simultaneously, as opposed to the traditional method where we used to align with a single actor. Now, these are some benefits. Of course, they are able to get some short-term benefits, for instance, regime survival, but it also risks exposing them to strategic entrapment. Strategic entrapment simply means that the African countries will be forced to do more than they expected whenever they get into relations with the Middle East countries. There is also the risk of erosion of autonomy. When you look at countries like Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and so on and so forth, most of their political trajectories are now determined by external actors, which means that the elite in those countries are not responding to the internal issues within the African countries. There is also the risk of a transactional diplomacy. If you notice the mode of interaction between the Middle East countries, they are looking for African countries because of what they can offer. So it is more transactional. And of course, that has a way of limiting the flexibility of policy making among the African countries. We can move on to the next slide. Now, the next area of concern in terms of impacts is the rise of violent extremism. Now, the conflicts in the Middle East are serving as multipliers of vulnerabilities in Africa. And one of the vulnerabilities that has been amplified a lot by these conflicts is violent extremism. Again, we can be able to see this from three perspectives. Most of the conflicts in the Middle East are framed from a religious point of view. And this is what the extremist groups in Africa are capitalizing on to recruit and also to mobilize within the continent. We could also ask ourselves, where do these violent extremist groups get their arms from? Where do they get their funding from? Where do they get the fighters from? Of course, that comes from the cross-regional networks between Africa and the Middle East. Now, the most affected are the fragile states, of course, because of the porous borders. The arms are able to pass across quite easily. But there is also the aspect of a weak governance. These countries are not able to guarantee security of their territories. Another interesting perspective is external intervention. We notice that quite a number of Middle East countries are now intervening in conflicts in Africa. But this kind of intervention is actually not motivated by addressing the root causes of the conflict. They are looking at prioritizing their geopolitical interest, which simply means that there are a lot of grievances in the African countries because the root causes are not addressed. And that this gives room for, it makes it a fertile ground for extremist groups to further their expansion. We can move on to the next slide. Now, another key area that we see a lot of impacts is in terms of economic investments. As we said in the first slide, a lot of investments from the Gulf countries or from the Middle East countries into Africa. Now, there are three key drivers of these investments. First one is food insecurity in the Middle East countries. These are countries that have a limited arable land. They have serious shortages of water. And the only way they can be able to guarantee their food security is looking to Africa. And then, of course, there is the market diversification. They are looking into venturing beyond oil industry. And again, Africa becomes an important market for them to diversify their markets. Then there is the geopolitical influence. Most of the Middle East countries, particularly Qatar, Saudi Arabia, are looking at how they can be able to expand their geopolitical influence. Again, the best area for them to do that is Africa. Now, there is a risk that comes with that, and this is where we see the impacts, is mainly because of the power disparities between the Middle East and African countries. Of course, the Middle East countries have an upper hand in terms of negotiations. So consequently, we see a lot of imbalanced trade agreements that tend to favor the Middle East countries. There are no attempts at helping African countries to rise above in terms of value addition. We are still exporting raw materials and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with this is that we have a lot of local tensions coming up. For instance, when you think about the investments in our food security, it is true that Horn of African countries have serious problems with their food security. But why are we leasing land to the Middle East countries instead of solving our own issues? So again, these investments come at a cost for the African countries. Can move on to the next slide, please. Now, an interesting area again is military bases, and I believe my co-host touched on this. The Horn of Africa particularly has become a center of attraction for foreign military bases. And we have a serious competition among the middle powers as well as the major powers in the Middle East. Now, there are quite a number of arguments that come with the military bases. Now, for instance, some would argue that it has served to improve maritime security, which is the main motivation for the Middle East countries. They would want to secure the maritime routes. But there is also the issue of counterterrorism, which is also true. But there is also the risk of generating mistrust. We see a lot of competition around the Red Sea. We see a lot of competition around the Gulf of Aden. Middle powers, major powers are competing for attention and control over these maritime routes. Now, what that does is it intensifies a lot of regional tensions within Africa and also between Africa and the Middle East. There is the argument of the host countries, how do they benefit? Some would argue that the elite are able to consolidate power. And to me, I see that as stifling democracy because these leaders are not able to remain accountable to the citizens. And of course, that also continues to exacerbate the internal tensions within the African countries. And lastly, there is the risk of the spillover effect. Again, the Middle East countries have been able to recruit some of the actors in Africa as their proxies. So again, that complicates the efforts of finding sustainable solutions to the conflicts in Africa. Remember, all this is coming from the conflicts or the crisis in the Middle East. Next slide, please. Now, closely related to the military bases is the maritime security. Now, it is not debatable that the Red Sea is a critical artery for global trade. We have a lot of energy shipment, a lot of commercial shipment passing through the Red Sea. Now, what happens if we have a crisis in the Middle East? One of the major impacts that is felt in Africa is the disruption of trade. And this is seen in terms of rerouting of vessels, again, to avoid the risks that come with the conflicts. Now, that means increased transportation costs. It means extended delivery times. And of course, most of the African countries are directly affected by these changes or trade disruptions. We cannot overemphasize the militarization of the maritime space. We've talked about the increase in the foreign military bases. When you look at Djibouti, for instance, it is one of the countries that is hosting the largest number of foreign military bases. Now, the last thing is we have a lot of inflationary pressures, especially in the African countries. And this, of course, threatens the domestic stability among the African countries. We see a lot of uprisings in the African countries as a response to these maritime disruptions. Next slide, please. Now, the question is, how can African countries navigate this tricky interdependence, if I may call it? As we've seen through the presentation, we have a lot of opportunities. Of course, we have a serious infrastructural gaps in Africa, and the Middle East countries are helping us to fill that. That's an opportunity that we can exploit. There is the expansion of the market. We are also able to benefit as the Middle East countries venture into Africa. But there is also the aspect of security cooperation, which benefits a number of host countries in Africa. But you're also exposed to a lot of vulnerabilities, geopolitical tension. We have a lot of interdependence between the two regions. So whatever happens in Middle East will definitely be felt in terms of security repercussions in Africa. Economic vulnerabilities. Middle East countries are more extractive. They are not helping African countries move up the value addition ladder. Again, that is a vulnerability as we venture into this interdependence. The other risk is, of course, the security risk. A lot of arms flows, increase in violent extremism, and so on and so forth. So the big question for African countries is how can we navigate this interdependence in such a way that we preserve our agency, in such a way that we are able to promote long-term stability in Africa, we are able to guarantee strength of our regional institutions, coordinate our policies, and of course, come up with a common way of dealing with the external partnerships. The last slide, please. So in conclusion, what we notice that the interdependence between Africa and the Middle East is not incidental. It is very structural, and I believe my co-host, my co-presenter alluded to that. And that simply means that whatever shocks that happen in the Middle East will definitely be felt in Africa. The crisis in the Middle East amplifies the vulnerabilities in Africa, whether it is violent extremism, the governance gaps, the maritime insecurity, the conflicts in the Middle East will definitely amplify that. The question for African countries is how we can be able to navigate this. It is not a question of insulating ourselves from the crisis in the Middle East, but how we can be able to engage with the Middle East in such a way that we are able to guarantee our own security and our own political trajectories. So I want to leave it at that point, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Solomon. Big question for Africa indeed. How do we navigate our security and the dependence on the Middle East? Thank you, Solomon. Thank you, Arvin. And I just want to bring the nexus between the two topics. Arvin spoke about Africa's digital future, which also highlighted Africa's dependence on the Middle East for connectivity and digital growth. And Solomon, you have just briefed us or spoken to us about the implications of the crisis in the Middle East and how it is affecting Africa's peace and security, still highlighting the fact that Africa is dependent on the Middle East for its peace and security, or the situation is affecting Africa's peace and security. Big question, like you have said, how do we navigate this? How does African government navigate the situation to make sure that they have control of their peace and security without necessarily depending on the Middle East? I think those are the highlights from the two presentations. I'm going to have to give both of you just 1-2 minutes. This is how I see the nexus between your topic, but in your view, how do you think that Africa's digital future and Africa's peace and security is connected with regards to the situation in the Middle East? So I may have to call Arvin to start, if you have a word or two about the nexus, the connectivity between both topics. I'm talking about Africa's digital future and Africa's peace and security, all linked to the Africa's dependence on the Middle East, which of course raises a lot of risk for growth given the situation at the moment.
Let me try and sum that up very succinctly in as little time as possible. I see we are almost out of time. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think the main concern for Africa is really the dependency of the choke points when it comes to international traffic. And I think that's a very important distinction that I need to make there. The majority of traffic on the internet does not travel internationally from Africa. Most of the traffic is in country or within the continent. It's the international traffic that really is the concern. And as African countries, we all depend heavily on international internet, especially with the sort of a combination of new services like IoT, data centers, software as a service, all these kinds of different new age technologies. And they depend heavily on international bandwidth and connectivity. So industry is really dependent on those links and on those choke points in the Middle East in order to break out to the rest of the world. And I think by us, working on those relationships with the Middle East and ensuring we have good relationships with the Middle East will also ensure that our traffic is in some way or another protected, as opposed to some of the, let's say, not so good intentions in terms of some of the players in the Middle East who are trying to disrupt that traffic by potentially cutting those undersea cables that will definitely jeopardize a lot of us here on the African continent.
Thank you very much, Arvin. Solomon, would you have a word? Because we are going to go to the audience for possible questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you, Immaculate. Now, the peace and security of the two regions is very much interdependent. The believers have demonstrated through the presentation, whatever happens in one region, of course, will be felt, the repercussions will be felt in the next region. But I also want to note that the Middle East countries have been very much involved in conflict intervention in Africa, of course, as a way of guaranteeing their own peace and security. But the downside of that is that their interventions are motivated by other factors, for instance, economic investments. They are eyeing their mineral resources in Africa. And of course, that makes them not to really be interested in addressing the root causes of the conflicts in Africa. So there is an argument that the interventions have actually contributed to intensification of conflict in Africa. When you look at Sudan, when you look at Somalia and many other countries, there is a clear testament of that. So while the interdependence to some extent is serving the interest of both countries, Africa finds itself receiving the shorter end of the stick in as far as peace and security is concerned. But to sum it up, for lasting peace, it is important that the two regions work together to find an amicable solution in addressing the problems that confront all of them. I believe that suffices. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Solomon. I think we have about 15 more minutes to the end of our session, and this is the time where we move to our audience. We've both listened to our speakers. If you have questions like Roslyn mentioned, just raise your hand and you will be given the opportunity to ask your question. Meanwhile, I think, Roslyn, we have questions in the chat box. I see a question from Denis Munu, and he says, previous external shocks such as the Russia-Ukraine war and the Red Sea crisis have already exposed Africa's vulnerabilities in supply chains, maritime security, and digital connectivity. And he says, why do Africa's states appear to respond relatively rather than institutionally? And what is preventing these lessons from being translated into durable policy and infrastructure reforms? Beautiful question. I think that question should go to Avin. Avin, do you mind?
To be honest, I think this kind of crisis and that should go to Solomon. I think he's more apt to discuss this kind of response in terms of the vulnerabilities in supply chains, maritime security, etc.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't mean to divert the question. I'll take the next one.
Okay. Solomon, please, you want to come in?
Yes, I can tackle this.
Okay.
Now, thank you, Dennis, for that good question. Now, apart from the interdependence between Africa and the Middle East, Africa is also not isolated from happenings in other parts of the world. So you'll definitely see that the conflict in Russia and Ukraine has some direct and indirect impacts in Africa. But now the question why do African states appear to respond reactively? Now, we have serious structural and operational challenges, especially with the African regional institutions, African Union, as well as the regional economic communities. And some of these structural challenges arise from, for instance, financial constraints. Are we able to accumulate enough finances to respond to these conflicts? Institutional challenges. Do we have good institutions that can actually be able to predict and take timely response in as far as these conflicts are concerned? So these are some of the challenges that African countries are contending with. It is not that these conflicts are not known in advance, but again, the capacity to respond is where African countries fall short of. So I believe that answers the first part of the question. The second question is, what is preventing these lessons from being translated into durable policy and infrastructural reforms? Again, that goes back to the institutional capacity of African institutions, whether it is African Union or any other regional economic communities. We do not have institutional capacity, whether it is adequate institutional capacity, whether it is in terms of finances, whether it is in terms of the experts that can be able to actually formulate these policies and ensure that they are fully implemented. So I believe that is the space where African institutions align, and that hinders our capacity to respond to these conflicts. I don't know if Dennis have answered your question. Thank you, Ima.
Thank you, Solomon. I want to believe you have. Oh, Dennis is giving a thumbs up, means you have. Thank you, Solomon. You are right. Solomon was best placed to answer that question, Avi. Now I'm bringing you in, and this question is for you. In terms of digital infrastructure on the sea, cable routes through the Red Sea and Suez Canal carry a significant share of Africa's internet traffic. And Brevin is asking, what is the realistic threat to these cables from the current instability, and are there credible redundancy plans?
Okay, let me answer that as best as I can. So the threat is real. It's not catastrophic yet. Cables in the Red Sea and Suez corridor are a genuine risk point, as I mentioned before. We've already seen multiple cuts causing slowdowns and rerouting. So the bigger concern is escalation. If conflict intensifies, the damage could also potentially increase. In terms of the risk, so cable break cuts are happening all the time. The problem is actually the repair delays in actually turning around and actually reconnecting and bringing the service back into place. So in Cape Town, I believe there's a big ship, the orange ship, that handles all these repairs. So we can remember, I think about a year ago, we had a massive disruption when the undersea cables were cut. This had a huge impact on service delivery, slow internet, et cetera, and this is crucial. In terms of redundancy, yes, redundancy exists, but it's not strong enough. So traffic can be rerouted. There are multiple subsea cables on the east coast and the west coast of Africa. So the traffic can be rerouted. So the internet won't go down completely, but performance degrades, costs will rise, and capacity will get strained as those routes become quite congested. In terms of diversification, it's happening, but not fast enough. New cables and alternative routes are being built, but many still pass through, let's say, the same choke points or delayed by the same geopolitical risks. So if I had to summarize, I would say Africa won't lose connectivity overnight, but it is more exposed than most regions. The system is resilient, but under sustained disruption. It will slow down, become more expensive and less reliable, but it will not completely go away, so to speak. I hope
Thank you,
I
Avi.
try
Yeah,
to answer that as best as possible. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. And there's also for Crystal, who wants to know, I think you've also talked about the weaknesses that the crisis has exposed already for Africa's digital structure and growth. But she also wants to know, what urgent steps should African countries take to strengthen their digital resilience?
Okay, thank you for that question. That's a good question. And I believe the current crisis has exposed potentially three very clear weaknesses in Africa from a digital infrastructure perspective. I think the first is the overdependence on a few international routes, which I've already pointed out to. So a significant portion of Africa's traffic still passes through that part of the world, the Red Sea and Egypt. When that corridor is disrupted, large parts of the continent feel it almost immediately. The second, limited in continent resilience. Many countries don't have strong terrestrial fiber connections or enough alternative landing points. So rerouting options are constrained and often insufficient. So one really needs to look at improving on those areas in terms of terrestrial fiber interconnections. And then the third is obviously one of the most important ones, which is the insufficient local infrastructure. So too much traffic is still being sent offshore because of limited local data centers cloud presence, and content caching. And that increases both vulnerability and costs. So, for example, when you're watching a Netflix movie in countries where the infrastructure isn't sufficient, you would still have to go and collect the content overseas somewhere instead of caching it locally. So you're still incurring huge costs by, having to go internationally to collect the content. Whereas if you had a caching a capability within your own data center or within one of the hyperscalers data centers in country, the traffic wouldn't have to go very far at all, and that traffic would be localized. So we could reduce costs, we can reduce latency, etc., etc. So I think those are pretty much the sort of crisis, the exposure in terms of the crisis. In terms of urgent steps, the priorities, Africa needs to diversify its international connectivity, as I said earlier. At the same time, there must be a strong push to build inter-Africa connectivity, as I said, the sort of the fiber backbones that will sort of connect each country. And then equally important is accelerating as I mentioned before, the localization of data and services. So more caching, more edge caching, things like that. And finally, we also need policy alignment and regional cooperation, because resilience at this level cannot be solved country by country, as I explained in my presentation. It's a combination of government, in-country, and investors that will help to address these issues. But the bottom line is the crisis has shown that Africa doesn't just need more connectivity. It needs smarter, more distributed, and more self-reliant digital infrastructure. I hope that has answered your question.
Thank you. I think so. That's the last question. We have just 3 more minutes by my time. I'm going to let Solomon come in to answer this last question in the chat box from Steve, who wants to know how countries in the Horn of Africa, particularly Kenya, can leverage from the rise in the middle powers, especially with reducing aid from security from the US, or reducing aid to security from the USA and Europe. And then he wants to know if there is a silver bullet. Interesting question. Solomon, do you want to quickly react to that?
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that question. Now, the simple answer to that, as I said, is that Africa cannot isolate or insulate itself from the crisis that is happening in the Middle East. The best that we can do is to see how we can increase our bargaining capacity. And of course, that is through the regional organizations. Through the region organizations, with a common voice, we can be able to confront or engage the Middle East countries in a better way. And I also believe with a strong regional capacity, we can be able to raise finances, of course, to counter that declining aid from Europe and the United States. So my simple answer to that is Africa should see how to increase its bargaining capacity.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Solomon. I'm going to have to invite Roslyn, who will be giving us some closing remarks. But I want to encourage you, if you have more questions, we can always keep the conversation flowing. But because of time, we will have to end the session really fast. But I think the key takeaways from our discussion thus far is the fact that Africa's digital growth and dependence has been largely dependent on the Middle East, as well as its peace and security. And the situation in the Middle East and the relations with Africa is an opportunity for African governments, particularly countries in the Horn of Africa, to rethink ways of retaking or regaining control of their digital space, as well as their peace and security. So thank you, Roslyn. At this point, I'm going to invite you. We are at exactly 3 p.m. But given that we started a few minutes late, I'll invite Roslyn for any final remarks before we call the session a day. Roslyn, are you there?
Yes. Okay. Good day, everyone. I would like to share a special word of thanks to our speakers who have highlighted how the implications of the Middle East crisis can affect our digital infrastructure, the security, as well as the economy of most African countries. And I would like to also give my form of appreciation to you, Miss Emma, for guiding us with our time allocation, making sure that we have reached within our time limit and guiding us within the conversation. Um, I would like to acknowledge that this session has highlighted what our digital future looks like, considering the Middle East crisis. At the same time, what ventures can African and government institutions can try to make in terms of engaging and responding to this kind of emerging challenges. I would like to invite everyone to turn on their cameras. We are going to take some screenshots for the webinar session. And please do check our chat box where we're going to share our social media handles, our emails. Please do follow us. And we have an upcoming webinar about climate adaptation in the month of May. Please do follow through on our social media accounts from LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, the immense level of information, and please do enjoy your rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day further.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
and please enjoy your week. Thank you.